Good morning. I'm Louis Freedberg, Executive Director of EdSource, and on behalf of EdSource and the Partnership for Each and Every Child, I'm pleased to welcome you this morning to this video conversation on the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was signed by President Obama just a little over a month ago, on December 10th. The purpose of this panel is to facilitate a conversation of researchers and practitioners around implications of the Every Student Succeeds Act in California in the coming years, and specifically how these reforms in California and nationally can meet the learning needs of at-risk, underserved, and politically underrepresented populations. We see this as a beginning of a conversation, not the end. The bill is over 1,000 pages long, and many of us, and I'm sure many of you who are participating, are still going through it to see exactly what it means. State Board of Education will be examining some of these same questions tomorrow at its meeting in Sacramento, which will also be live streamed, and I encourage all of you to tune in then to get further answers on these issues. I have to point out that a new acronym, ESSA, has already crept into everyday language of many of us, and I'm sure many of you, to refer to this new legislation. We will try to keep our use of these and other acronyms to a minimum, but forgive us if we occasionally lapse into bad habits. We have a highly distinguished panel here today, chosen to represent diverse perspectives, not because they agree with each other. Let me introduce them quickly to you. On the panel, we have Linda Darling-Hammond, who is President and CEO of the Learning Policy Institute. Chris Edley, sitting next to me here, Chair of Partners for Each and Every Child and co-founder of the Opportunity Institute. Rick Miller, sitting next to Chris here, is Executive Director of the Core Districts, and Rick will explain what those are, and also Principal in the consulting firm Capital Impact. Michelle Rodriguez, joining us from Anna. Michelle is Assistant Superintendent for K-12 Teaching and Learning in Santa Ana Unified School District. Also on the line from Santa Rosa is Socorro Shiels, who is, at least for the next couple of weeks, superintendent of the Santa Rosa City Schools. Then she will be joining Carl Cohn as education director for the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, and she'll tell us what that's about as well. Also on the line from Southern California is Tom Saenz, who is president and general counsel from the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Also with us from Oakland is Ryan Smith, Executive Director of Education Trust West. You will have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will be collecting these to address them during the Q&A portion of today's presentation. So let me welcome the panelists and all of you who have joined us. We are going to very briefly go into some of the policy basics of the Every Student Succeeds Act. For those of you who are still grappling with it. Basically, some of the key points. The law goes into effect in the 2017-18 school year. So that means there is still some time to figure all of this out. We don't have to do it this week or this month. But fortunately, this does allow for careful consideration of these issues. After that, states have to submit accountability plans to the Department of Education, beginning in the 2017-18 school year. Like in the No Child Left Behind law, all students must be tested in grades 3 through 8 and once in high school. They must also be tested in science. And results have to be reported for subgroups and for schools. The subgroups being English learners, special ed students, racial and ethnic minorities, and low-income students. There also has to be 95% participation in those tests. As far as accountability goals, states have to pick their own goals, which must address proficiency on the tests, on English language proficiency, and graduation rates. In the case of elementary and middle schools, don't have graduation rates, so some other academic indicator has to be used. And this is brand new Innovation, mirroring something that's already happening in California, multiple measures. States must also incorporate at least one additional measure in their accountability goals, such as student engagement, educator engagement, access to or completion of advanced coursework, and post-secondary readiness. Also other items or dimensions such as school climate. Goals have to be set so that all groups that are furthest behind move towards closing gaps in achievement and graduation rates. One of the tricky areas that we will be talking about today is that the states have to identify and intervene in the bottom 5% of lowest performing schools as measured by these goals that the states themselves will be set. And these have to be identified, these lowest performing schools have to be identified once every 3 years for the first time in the 2017-18 school year. There are funds in the bill to support teacher quality, supporting induction, mentoring, teacher leader preparation, and alternative routes for state certification. Also, some funding increases for preschool, Title IV, technology, innovations, and student supports, a push on community schools, also an important new element in the bill. That very briefly are some of the key issues, and as I was saying, there's over 1,000 pages of provisions, some of which we will be talking about further. Why are we looking at this? Even though California, and now under the new bill, places less of an emphasis in the accountability provisions on testing, the latest results from California's Smarter Balanced Tests Administration underscores the work that still has to be done. You will see that the percentage of students who have not met standards as measured by the Smarter Balanced Test scores are very high for English learners, for economically disadvantaged students, in both English language arts and math. And you will see the differences that still exist, the vast achievement gaps that exist between Asian, white, Black, and Hispanic students, both in English language arts and math. Chris, you are co-chair and commissioner for the Equity and Excellence Commission. To what extent do you think that the new federal law will help promote greater equity?
Well, let me make a couple of quick points, Louis. First, I want to remind everybody that in the federal structure there is first the authorization statute, which is what was passed, what was signed by the president a month ago. But following that each year, there has to be an appropriations bill. So the monies that are laid out in the authorization bill may or may not actually be funded when Congress gets around to making an appropriation each year. So when we look at things like the early childhood money or the professional development money, any of those sums are promises that are very unlikely to be met at 100%. Particularly given the budgetary climate and the politics on Capitol Hill these days. So that's the first point I'd make, is promises very different from fiscal commitments. The second thing I'd say is there's plenty to work with in the new statute, but it really does take what I viewed as an already weak federal ability to hold states and districts' feet to the fire. And makes it even weaker. When you combine that, I think, with a fairly weak accountability structure in California, I think there's good cause for worry as to whether or not all of the possibilities, the potential for narrowing gaps and improving excellence will come to fruition. A lot is going to depend upon what people in California do to put pressure on policymakers to ensure that the state plans that are drafted during this calendar year really take advantage of all the possibilities and indeed go beyond the minimum requirements of ESSA and indeed the minimum requirements of LCFF and the LCAP system.
Great, thank you, Chris. I'm going to go to Tom Sines. Tom, president of MALDEF. Although there are many Latino students who are obviously doing outstandingly in the state, on average, Latino students continue to lag behind academically. Do you think California is on the right track in its approach to reforms? And to what extent do you think that the new federal law will help ensure that lagging students will succeed academically?
Thanks, Louis. I think that we all know that the local control funding formula means that California has taken an extraordinary step to engage in weighted funding, recognizing the need to invest greater in 3 categories of students: foster students, English learners, and low socioeconomic status students. That's an important step forward. However, as the name indicates, local control funding formula, it gives a lot of discretion to local districts, and frankly, performance has been to date uneven, particularly in looking at the outcomes that result from the additional investment of resources and how that translates into achievement for groups of students like Latino students, so critically important in California given their proportion of the student body. I think that the Every Student Succeeds Act has the potential, by requiring California to focus more on those outcomes, creating a multiple measured system of accountability where most of the measurements are based on student achievement, looking at subgroups, specifically disaggregating data, looking at subgroups, and then identifying schools not just based on overall performance, but also on subgroup performance, including not only Latinos, but English learners, another critically important group, given their proportion of the student body in California. That potentially means that with the pressure from folks inside the state that Chris has already talked about, that the ESSA gives us an opportunity to strengthen the step forward in LCFF to ensure that there's more of a focus on outcomes, specifically closing the achievement gaps. That's now an explicit goal of the federal law, changes from what the purpose of No Child Left Behind had been, which was to focus on bringing all students to proficiency. This one specifically says the purpose is to close those achievement gaps. And with that focus and with an accountability system very carefully and rigorously put together, we have an opportunity to ensure that the investments being made through LCFF actually result in outcome changes and closing those achievement gaps. I emphasize, as Chris has, that it really depends upon vigorous engagement by all interest groups in California at ensuring that we use the federal acts to improve upon what is already in some ways embedded in the LCAPs that each district has adopted, to ensure that we have a statewide system that will actually measure and ensure that we are intervening to achieve a reduction, significant reduction, ultimately elimination of the achievement gaps that continue to affect not only Latino students, but African American students, as your data has already shown, Louis, but English learners as well, and low SES students.
Tom, I mentioned to ask you earlier, the public does have an opportunity to have their voice heard in the implementation of this law. Could you just explain briefly how this process works and what those opportunities are?
Sure. I think the immediate opportunity is that the Federal Department of Education is engaging in public hearings. They held one yesterday in Washington, D.C., and one a week from today in Los Angeles, to hear from interest groups about what should be done at the federal level with respect to the new act. As Chris has indicated in many ways, and the media has indicated, this act steps back from federal involvement. It does leave great discretion in the states and localities, but as the department recognizes in seeking input yesterday and next week in Los Angeles, there is opportunity for the federal government to weigh in with clarifying guidelines to ensure that folks understand and implement the law as intended. I think this is an opportunity to ensure that the federal government is still vigorously involved in trying to achieve educational equity across the board. Our opportunity in California is next Tuesday in Los Angeles. The deadline to request a 5-minute slot to present your perspective on what the federal government should be doing in terms of regulations is actually today at 5 o'clock Eastern time, so 2 o'clock our time, but folks can get in and come to UCLA and explain to the federal government why they need to continue despite the step back from the level of federal involvement. The federal government needs to remain involved in ensuring that as much as possible through clarification, guidelines, even guardrails as they might be called, no specificity because the law is very specific about preventing the Secretary of Education from making specific edicts, but regulations can help to ensure that the promise in the law is fulfilled, particularly in California where we, given the proportion of our student body made up of Latinos and African Americans, really need to ensure that significant strides are made in closing those achievement gaps.
Can I jump in, Louis? I just want to point out that there's a parallel challenge here. At the federal level, the real test is going to be on the rigor, the care with which the federal government reviews and approves state plans. Here in California, the same is true. The question is going to be, particularly with a governor who believes in sort of just giving it to the locals and seeing what happens and not collecting a lot of data about it, whether or not the state will step up and really look at the local plans to ensure that they fulfill the purposes not only of the federal statute, but also of the state statute. And then finally, there's the question of how rigorous, what kind of quality will be demanded of schools and districts that are required to develop improvement plans. And actually, Socorro will play a critical role in that, in her role in the California Consortium.
I'm going to get to Linda in 1 minute, but Socorro, your name has been mentioned.
Republican debate. Is that how it works?
So I'm going to ask you to jump in. You're going to be joining the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence. Can you just explain briefly what that is? And then the focus of the federal law is very much on schools, whereas California's emphasis has been on more on the district level. How do you see yourself being able to balance those two as the collaborative moves forward?
Well, first, the collaborative really is set by the legislature as a new organization to help both with the accountability schema still to being defined, but also in terms of technical assistance and helping schools and districts achieve their intended outcomes through the LCAP and the best ways to do that and ensure that. And certainly with some of those schools and districts that are identified as needing support from these other outside organizations. Carl Cohn, Dr. Cohn has been working with the organization now, I believe, several months, and the full team comes together next month. There are 4 of us from across the state, really looking at how that operationalized comes together, how we work with all of these existing entities and organizations that have been doing this work, whether that's CORE, whether that's county offices, whether that's the Department of Education, and how all of us together harmonize to support schools and districts in these efforts. And I think that commitment to equity and that tension between what's happening at the local level, yet a commitment to students and their families for the social good and for their public education, I think that'll be the tension, and how we do that will certainly be listening and learning from a lot of the work that's already been done. There are multiple perspectives on this, but the thrust will be making real work happen at the local level and ensuring that people are moving forward with the commitments they've made. So this tension in time between accountability and responsibility and what used to be sanctions and shame, right? We're in a different place there. And I think also this idea of how we do support and capacity building measured against decision making at the local level. Those are all conversations in progress, and certainly there are no answers, but lots of exciting opportunities.
Great. Okay, we'll get back to you on. We will get back to some of those issues. But Linda Darling-Hammond, do you think the new law mostly supports reforms that are already underway in California, some of the ones that Socorro referred to? And where do you see the possible friction points that need to be resolved?
It's a great question. I do think that this law is, in some respects, catching up to where California has already gone. It does, put forward the idea of multiple measures, which California asserted several years ago. It requires some measures and allows states to undertake others. Interestingly, the law has some additional components that focus on equity and opportunity that the old law did not have, and I think it's worth taking stock of those. One of the things is that it does require that in addition to math and English language arts scores, that we track English proficiency gains as part of the multiple measures dashboard. Of course, there's graduation rates. Among the other measures can be opportunity to learn measures, and one of the things that California has done, which is quite extraordinary, is not only passing the most progressive school finance formula in the country with LCFF, which is a huge equity move, but also in the state priorities, including opportunity to learn indicators, which can now be part of our accountability system for the feds as well as for the state. And those include things like what proportion of kids, disaggregated by subgroups of students, are completing a college preparatory curriculum. That's an outcome measure, but it's also an opportunity to learn measure. Who's getting access to and completing this rigorous curriculum? What proportion of kids are completing a state-approved curriculum and technology CTE sequence, which has standards associated with it? Which percentage are doing both by subgroup? Those are really important opportunity to learn measures, which we can now incorporate not only in our state system, as we have begun to do, but also in our federal system. What proportion of kids, African American kids, Latino kids, special education kids, English learners, are completing AP, IB, dual credit courses, are getting access to a full, rich curriculum? All of these are parts of the California state priorities, which can be brought into the federal accountability system. So I think that that's actually progress, potential progress around equity, if it's coupled with the kind of care and attention that Chris talked about at the county level to really manage the LCAP process, and with state focus on both the opportunities and the outcomes. Now, here's the one place where I think we're going to see some real arm wrestling and discussion and so on about the federal requirements for accountability. There may be more than this one, but at least this one, and what California has proposed to do. We've, in California, begun talking about maintaining a multiple measures dashboard so that you're always looking at the range of things that districts are doing. I didn't even mention suspension and expulsion rates, which is a very important thing to have gotten on the table as a opportunity move for particularly students of color who were disproportionately experiencing exclusion.
And just to clarify,
dashboard, and the feds, they want to create more of an the language of the law could push you back to a single dimensional index or grading scheme, although I think it can be interpreted in a way that will allow us to keep all of those things prominent in the system.
Can be interpreted that way.
I think so, because it says that you have to have greater weight. It says you have to have greater weight on on the academic outcomes, so you do need to be sure that those are getting the most attention. But there are decision rule systems that exist in some states and could exist under the law, which say we will, when we look at all of the different measures, give greater attention to these when we're designating schools who get intensive intervention and support than we do to those, without having to revert to having only a single number or grade. You know, you're a 722, or you're a C plus or a D minus or something like that, which then loses you all the information that would help you improve the schools that are kept in the dashboard.
And Linda, when you refer to dashboard, it means like on a car with all these different indicators of how the car is doing versus one measure.
Right. And it wouldn't help you if your car told you that you were scoring a 33 and you didn't know that you were running out of gas, right? Because you didn't see that indicator on the dashboard. You just got a rolled up average of your tire pressure and your gas gauge and, you know, all of these other things. So
What about the dead battery?
it's to be able to look at all of the things that matter.
Thanks for that. I'm gonna jump now to Ryan Smith in Oakland. Ryan, EdTrust West did issue a brief on what the law means for equity and accountability in California. Do you see that there are lots of points of agreement? And in terms of the disagreements, are these resolvable, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, number one, first I want to say, just to echo what Tom and Chris said around the need for greater oversight within states around equity. We are absolutely going to need equity-minded educators and civil rights groups and equity advocates to be more meaningfully involved in the design and implementation of our accountability system. It's going to actually have to happen state by state, but in California, getting into the details is going to be important. That's why even that hearing at UCLA that Tom mentioned is going to be really, really important. So I do want to talk a little bit about where I see points of alignment and where I see points of contention regarding ESSA. Number one, I think where California is actually above the curve is around data disaggregation. So, you know, ESSA actually asked that we disaggregate data around homeless youth and foster youth. And, you know, LCFF is actually, through the LCAP, is somewhat addressing the needs of those populations. But ESSA actually asks us to take it one step further in looking at graduation rates as well as test scores for those students as well. California is not currently doing that. The state board is going to have to reconcile that. We also see ESSA asking for challenging academic standards as well as annual assessments. Because we've implemented the CASP system of assessments, we're actually ahead of the curve of where most states are. So those are places where we see some real positive alignment. But there are some serious points of contention that the state is going to have to grapple with and reconcile. So, you know, ESSA asks that we meaningfully differentiate amongst three types of schools. Number one, comprehensive support schools, which are the bottom 5% of Title I schools and schools that are graduating less than 2/3 of their students. They talk about target support schools where subgroups are chronically underperforming at some schools, and they also discuss the need to do additional targets around schools that are not meeting the state's exit criteria. Though, and you know, meaningful differentiation really means that you know, we are aggregating data, and I don't see how we get around that with a data dashboard. I think a data dashboard is insufficient in my interpretation of the law in meeting ESSA's requirements. So, you know, whether it's one index or some other type of system, we are going to have to aggregate some of that data. I think the second part is around state goals. So when you, ESSA asks that state goals be ambitious, that they provide targets, etc. And right now, and in my opinion, you know, wrong-headedly, the state board is looking at a proposal to look at school and district performance against state averages. And unless the state can make a viable argument that state averages are aspirational, I think we're going to have to go back to the drawing board, particularly when we talk about equity, particularly when we talk about gap closing. We're going to have to be more aggressive in our setting of goals. I think lastly, I think what is really important, probably the most interesting part for me, is this issue around supports and interventions. And we keep bringing up Socorro's name because, of course, she's going to figure all of this out. But you know, the law absolutely, you know, says that that states are going to have to work with those three categories of schools and creating plans to help really turn the curve on the data. But everything around local control and LCFF outside of charter schools is really focused on county offices of education as well as districts. So, you know, right now the state is not in the business of schools. So, Carl Cohn and Socorro and others, when it comes to interventions and supports, are going to have to think about how to really support those schools. And right now, we don't currently have that within the local control context. And I think there will have to be some type of statutory change in order for that to work. So there's definitely work that has to be done in order to really ensure the type of equity necessary to close achievement opportunity gaps.
Could I ask for a clarification from Ryan?
Go for it, Linda. Yeah.
You mentioned that data will have to be aggregated, and I wondered if you were talking about being sure that the state has some indicators that are aggregated, comparable indicators across districts, or whether you were talking about combining different indicators into a single metric rather than leaving them separate.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question. And I think that's one that we're going to have to grapple with. I'll be the first to say that the API and a single index may not be where we need to go, that there may be other ways to do that. But when it comes to the bottom performing schools across the state, we are going to have to figure out how to aggregate that data somehow. And, maybe that's, that could be interpreted very differently, and I'm not going to go kind of in the ins and outs of design right now, but I don't think it has to be an index, right. But we do have to do some indexing according to the law.
You have to have some decision rules by which you can say if a district or a school, they're focusing on schools, our system is focusing on districts, and that will be something that will have to get worked out. But if you could have decision rules that say if you're not making gains over 3 years on 2 of the academic outcome indices and 3 of the others, then you are going to be in the intensive intervention group or whatever. You could have decision rules that look at the indicators and say you have to have certain kinds of gains in order to be in a continuous improvement modality rather than an intensive intervention modality.
I'm gonna.
But let me just respond really quickly. I'll just say this on the merits, though. I think you're right, Linda. But having worked with parents for the majority of my career as a senior director of family community engagement at LUSD, I know that parents want and need to see some type of summary data around how their schools are performing within neighborhoods. So you're right in interpretation of law, but on the merits of equity, I think it's important for public accountability and reporting that we are thinking about how do we simplify this and not make it more complicated.
If you think about parents, when you get the student's report card, you want to know how they're doing in math, how they're doing in reading and English. You want to know how they're doing in social studies and science. And I think parents can interpret a report card that tells you how you're doing on several subject areas. The question then is you do need a decision rule about, when does a school need to be in an intensive intervention context, and we will be required to do that under the law.
I want to bring in Rick Miller and Michelle Rodriguez. Rick, you've been grappling with this, a single measure versus multiple measures with the core districts. So just tell us what's happening with the core districts? What are the core districts?
Great.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. Thank you. So the core districts are a group of 9 mostly large districts across the state. Michelle Rodriguez, Santa Ana is one of our districts. Came together 4 or 5 years ago to collaborate. The notion that we're better working together on shared problems of practice. Several years ago, though, after the state of California did not receive a federal waiver for No Child Left Behind, our districts applied and received one. So we're the only group of districts in the country that got a waiver. As a result, we've been working on this new accountability system for several years together from sort of a ground-up perspective. And so with that background, we just sort of jump into this exact conversation and say, let me tell you what we did as an example. And what obviously I think there's merit to what we did. There's learning from what we did. And we did index. And I think there's good and bad about that. What I would argue,
you're trying to come up with
we have a single number. However, that single number is something that we did it to identify the lowest 5%. It's something we downplay. We don't put it out there. What I will say is my big problem with the API was not necessarily that it was indexed.
The API is academic performance
index. All right. You're my interpreter, which I appreciate. Okay. was that it indexed a single measure. It indexed a test score, right? And so when you're indexing a single measure, you're really not getting a full view of what's happening in the school, and that's why multiple measures matters so much. And we actually have 10 measures that we look at in our accountability system, including suspension, expulsion, specifically looking at disproportionality, EL redesignation rates. We do surveys of parents and teachers and students. We have academic achievement. We have growth. So we have all these different measures that I think independently matter a lot. And so the reason, though, that I find the indexing of those important, I don't want to lose in this conversation, is what we found was by indexing each individual metric, we're able to compare those metrics. So as a principal, we've just given our reports to every principal in the state, and we have 1 million students in our system, so all the principals in our schools have received these reports. And what they say is, so they say your proficiency or your graduation rate is 82%. We do a 4, 5, 6 year cohort. You're 82%, and that's great. I think it's good. It's bad. I'm not sure. But because we indexed it, it actually allows you to say not only are you 80%, but here's where you are compared to every other school in the state. You're actually at the 40th percentile, or you're at the 90th percentile, and then we actually color coded green, yellow, and red for where you are. And what we found was the principal said to us and teachers in our networks, that was the most valuable part of what they received, because it gave them an indication of where they really need to focus, right? So knowing the percentage is fine, but knowing where I stand relative allows me as a leader to focus. And we wouldn't know that if we hadn't done some indexing to better understand where they are compared to other schools in the state. And so I think we don't want to lose this. Having said that, I think as Linda pointed out, you could index across all those measures and then pay attention to those. I will also say, though, as an intervention strategy, we do have, not a lot, but we do have schools for whom they're in the bottom percentage across every single one of our indicators, and we need to make sure that we're paying attention to those schools and intervening in a serious manner. The final thing I'll say is, from an intervention perspective, to Socorro and her work, our intervention strategy actually is not about a top-down intervention strategy, but it's actually about teachers and educators working together. So it's pairing schools, high-performing schools, and schools that are struggling together, and it's building communities of practice around shared problems of practice. You're doing a plan, do, study, act cycle with them. It's proven effective. I think there's reason to believe we're onto something. We don't know yet. I can't say definitively. But ultimately, my point here is that what ESSA says is the state has to ensure there's intervention. It doesn't say the state has to intervene. And I would strongly argue the state doesn't have the capacity or the ability to get into these schools and fix them. They just have to ensure that we're doing it. And I believe the way to do that is building capacity and bringing educators together, not the state going in and taking schools over, because I would say that has not worked in the history of California.
Can I just
add, Chris wants to add
something. Can I just ask you, though, in general, does the Every Student Succeeds Act, does that complement, support what you're doing, or do you see this as creating?
Yeah, I think it's what everyone says, which is it could, it allows it. I mean, I think, but what it does, interestingly for us, in a very, very unique perspective, is every other state that had a waiver, it allows them to take the work they do on the waiver and just make it happen. Because we were doing that as a group of districts, now we have to sort of work with the state. My strong concern around its new empowerment of the state is the state will be inclined to go with what they have, which is a very limited data set of very limited measures, and sort of say, we're going to hold you accountable for these things. You can go ahead and pay attention to whatever you want to, but these 3 measures that we have, that's what matters to us. We know that's what API and adequate and what NCLB was. We're paid to just test scores, but you can do whatever you want. Unless we're held accountable for multiple measures in a meaningful way, it's not going to change. And so I think that's going to be an important conversation going forward.
And I'm going to, Chris, can I
ask
you to hold that, because I want to get Michelle Rodriguez in, who's actually in the trenches working with kids. I've spent some time with Michelle in Santa Ana, and boy, she's just doing remarkable work. And as I implement the new standards, the Common Core in classrooms and in the school district that is overwhelmingly Latino and very high percentage of English learners. So, Michelle, what do you see as the opportunities, if any, in this new legislation? And is this something you worry about, that this could undermine some of the work you're doing?
No, not at all. I actually think that it will help support the work that we're doing. We firmly believe that the closer that the decisions are made to the students, to the parents, to the community, the better. And so just as LCAP has helped to support that, we believe that ESSA will do so as well. Also knowing that it's really looking at a well-rounded education and equitable access. We talk a lot about equity and access for students. Well, we believe that that should be through personalized learning, which is actually cited within the bill, and also competency-based learning. A child should be taken where they are currently and then move forward. And through having measures or assessments that require us to look at more than just the academics, that requires us to look at multiple measures, it actually will force us to in turn look to ensure that all those equities are in place. And so as we're moving forward, we actually think it will reinforce the work that we're doing. It will, of course, all be in the implementation and how well are the evidence-based plans developed, how much are they in fact aligned with the context in which the school is actually facilitating, how well not only does the state actually look at what is happening, but also the district as well. And so as in Santa Ana, you know, we believe that that both the ideas of the assessment and the ideas of the well-rounded education will actually, in fact, help accelerate the work that we're already beginning. For example, we just infused in the last 18 months 21,000 devices into our system to ensure anytime access for all students, not only at school but at home. And Title IV definitely helps support that and even fund those measures.
And is there language in the legislation that refers to the well-rounded child? Is that something we talked about?
Yeah, so it specifically talks, and Linda talked a little bit about it earlier, but it talks about the well-rounded education. And it is exactly aligned to LCAP. So for us, when you look at our LCAP, our district LCAP goals, and you look at ESSA, it actually has a pretty close to one-in-one alignment. We have a focus on expanding CTE pathways to ensure that they actually end in certifications and
career and technical education pathway.
Right.
Yeah.
And also advanced placement courses. We've had significant expansion not only to access in Santa Ana over the last 3 years, but also, of course, looking at success on the assessment, where they must have a 3 or better. And so all those, whether it's arts and music that they actually note in there. So we're developing currently a music conservatory. All those things are things that we believe in. We believe that students of poverty need access to those opportunities, that often the achievement gap is actually an opportunity gap. And so whether it is LCAP that is providing us those funds through supplemental and concentration funds, or it's additional federal funding, we believe that we actually can and will make that growth with all of our student populations with the support of both legislation.
And Michelle Rodriguez, you're one of the core districts, right, that Rick Miller was talking about?
We are.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but where do you come down on this index in terms of your schools and your district being ranked or rated? Do you like the multiple dashboard?
I think that there's been significant work. It definitely has been a collaborative process. So this has been a process where all the districts were involved from the beginning in every single decision point. And so we are fully committed to the index. We believe that it's the right thing to do for our community, our parents, our principals, and our teachers. So we have been, it's not something that was developed for us, but it was definitely developed in partnership with every single core district.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Chris, I held you back before, so.
Well, quickly, I'd say, and maybe I'm pushing back a little bit at the framework with which you're approaching some of this, Louis. I think there's a very big difference between asking of either the federal statute or the state statute, but let's focus on the state, of asking whether the legal structure, the regulatory structure supports or at least accommodates good leaders like Socorro and Michelle, who have a strategy that is promising or is proven, versus asking whether or not the structure at the state level will take districts and schools that are at the other end of the spectrum in performance, that are struggling, that aren't sure what they should be doing, and actually pushes them to do better. Now, I think it's certainly clear that both the federal and state statute make it possible that there will be that effective push at the low-performing districts and schools. But I think what advocates should be pushing for, particularly equity advocates, should be pushing for more certainty that something will be done, not just to accommodate the effective leaders, but something will be done to support, push leaders that are really struggling to make progress with the students who are in the deepest need. I don't see that yet in California's structure. And I think it needs to be there as they move to implement ESSA.
So can I ask, because I don't necessarily disagree with that at all. Having said that, you could make a strong argument that you just defined NCLB, right? So
no, I'm not being prescriptive about the type of intervention.
But that is also what I do want to say is what have we? There has been a if you don't, we will be very serious on you. So what would you say the learning has been from NCLB that we wouldn't want to replicate?
No child left behind.
No child left behind.
Yeah.
I think it's clear that there were very unfortunate mechanistic approaches to the interventions and to the prescriptions. The federal statute and the state statute now, I think, put a lot of hope in the process of reviewing plans and getting some peer review in place. And the question I think that we have to be vigilant about is to whether or not, for example, Socorro's organization, the California Coalition, gets the resources it needs to be effective at providing the technical assistance and the coaching and the evaluation that we all want. And so I think that we don't want leaders in districts and schools that need improvement to be rearranging the deck chairs.
Right.
And ultimately, that's the standard, that's the test that we want to apply to the state plan. Does the state plan ensure that we'll be doing more than rearranging the deck chairs in struggling districts?
I think that's really the nub of the problem, and I'm glad to hear it framed that way, because we've been talking about the question of how would we identify the bottom 5% of Title I schools as required in the law, and one could do that with, as CORE does, with taking multiple measures into an index for that purpose, but then using the multiple measures for the diagnosis and the support and the decision-making about how to proceed. Or you could do it with other decision rules. But the question is, whichever way we do it, we have to be able to know what to do that's going to be high leverage, successful intervention in those schools, regardless of what the decision rules get there. And that's where I think it's really important to try to preserve not only the kind of measures, the multiple measures that California has, which include these opportunity to learn measures that tell you more about what kids are getting and who's getting what, and what's the range of outcomes, and then put it in a system like some states have, like a school quality review system where you get additional qualitative diagnostics from an expert team who can come in, and having then access to the kinds of strategies that CORE has developed and others that might be developed that really help a school know where it needs to improve and get very, very targeted, specific help to do that. And Socorro's nodding, so I think she's going to tell us how that's going to happen.
And then we're going to go to some of our questions. We try to make this a conversation.
Lewis, if I can just intervene, I think that what Linda's described, I interpret the act as.
Tom, you just hold on one second. We were just going to jump to Socorro, and then we'll jump right back to you. Thanks. Okay.
Oh, no, I was very comfortable with him jumping in at that point. That was fine. I think it'll be harnessing all of this information and ideas that have been circulating. Some of it is new, some of it is innovation, and some of it has stood the test of time in terms of evidence and research, in terms of things that have to be existing at schools and districts for success to be an opportunity for all students. And I think some of the language that we've used in terms of friction points, I think that will be the interesting challenge to us, is how do we clarify these intentions with actions that can be assured. And I think all these issues of equity surrounding, we've had great intent for a long time, and that doesn't mean that our outcomes have matched our intent. And so how do we make sure that wherever a child is, whatever school, whatever district, that promise is held true? And I think that will be what I hope is my next great adventure in terms of work with CCE and Carl, is helping identify those practices and making them accessible to all. Much of the work that CORE has done really was, while it affects a lot of students, it doesn't necessarily affect a lot of districts. And how do we bring more districts into opportunities like that with peer growth, strategic thought partners, and resources to ensure we're all growing stronger at the same time?
Tom, briefly, you want to jump in? Then we're going to go to some questions here. Yeah.
It's okay. You can go to the questions. I think that this issue of how we construct the accountability system is going to be the central concern. I think that the system that Linda first described is what I interpret the Act as inviting. It is attention to multiple measures, but that are then drilled down to some sort of index. And I wanted to make clear, it's not just an index school by school, but you then have to decide not only what is the bottom 5% school by school, but look at subgroups at every school and determine which of those subgroups are performing at that 5th percentile level if they were a school on their own. And in a state like California, that means potential interventions way beyond bottom 5. It means well more than 5% of schools. And the multiple measures are there so that everyone, parents and teachers and administrators and those at the county and the state level, are able to assess what are the evidence-based interventions that are going to specifically target the groups and issues that exist within a district. I think that's the beauty of the Act, is that it sets up potentially an accountability system that does exactly that. Now, that's going to be easier in California given what we've already done. It's going to be much tougher in other states, and that's where really federal role is critically important, trying to ensure that every state puts in place that kind of an intervention system that serves every subgroup. Given the proportion of our population in California that is English learners and Latinos, we're going to address those issues and have been. Not as effectively as we should, and we have lots of work to do, but in other states, English learners in particular have been neglected. And I think that we have to make sure that this new system means that there's that kind of accountability and interventions everywhere. And that impacts California as well, because so many students we inherit who have moved from other states.
Well, great. One of the questions we have here is how do you propose that community-based organizations go about educating parents about this new law? And are there tools and resources that can help? Anybody want to take that on?
I'll take it on. I think we're going to have to do a lot of capacity building with parents to really understand what is the value proposition of the accountability system. How do they get involved? What does it mean? What are multiple measures? I think some parents do understand, are sophisticated enough to look through data. Others are going to need some help and support, and we're going to have to think about how we formalize that as well. And there's going to be some advocacy that's going to have to still happen within the state around the accountability system that I think parent organizers in particular can play a role. So I think the key thing about parents is how do you really partner with school districts, with schools, in order to create a rich, vibrant school improvement system. And we need to create more access points for parents to do so.
And I would just add on to that, that in Santa Ana we have found that the closer that you provide the information to the schools, the more access that parents actually have. When you do it at either a state level or a district event, the parents that feel comfortable to come to that setting is one set of parents versus other parents that will actually come to the individual school sites is a whole nother set of parents. And so for our LCAP, and I would assume similar for ESSA, we actually are doing all of our LCAP meetings at school sites. We're not making parents come to us, we're coming to them. And so I would just encourage people to go to the parents versus making parents, especially parents of fragile student populations, have to come to you.
And I would just like to add that I think, going back to something that Chris said in another context, we have to recognize that while California has made great steps forward in terms of parental involvement through the LCAP process, and I think it has resulted in real progress in lots of districts, there are some districts where the progress has been uneven and, in fact, disappointing in other respects. And so I think in addition to the organizing and capacity building on the parent side, at the state level we have to be more serious about ensuring meaningful parental involvement. I don't think, unfortunately, this federal act goes as far as I wish it would, and I think the state needs to step in to hold some of those districts that aren't doing as well in terms of meaningful parental involvement, hold their feet to the fire and put in place some form of accountability for measuring how meaningful parental involvement is, particularly from those communities like English learners, where traditionally there have been barriers to meaningful parental involvement in in many, many districts across the state.
I'm going to direct a question to Chris. One of the things we're trying to, initiative we've kind of started at EdSource is making school reform work. All these reforms are in place. The law is in place. The LCFF is in place. The Common Core is in place. So regardless of what one might think about all these reforms, they're in place. So how are we going to make these work? So Chris, question, if in 10 years we want to see the headline ESSA, using the acronym, shrinks achievement gap, what are the 2 or 3 most important things that need to be implemented well? And yeah.
Well, I try to think of this in systems terms. So I guess what I'd like, and by that I mean this, I think that we need to have in place a robust system in which districts and schools that are searching for ways to make improvement have ready access to high quality ideas for what kinds of interventions, what kinds of supports to deploy. That they're not moving around in the dark, that they're not operating out of intuition and gut, but whenever possible they're relying upon evidence, and it's easy for them to get to. It's easy to bring it to them. That's one thing that I want to see in terms of a change in the structure and the change of the dynamic that will support the kind of continuous improvement that Linda's been preaching for a couple of decades now.
Can I just put it up? I can get it right back to you. Yeah. One thing I'd say is, what we found too, is it's not enough to just simply say, here's the best practice, now go do it. It's actually being part of a collaborative and talk about it, to work with the educator and actually be part of the system. You can't just sort of look it up on the web and then go do it. You have to be part of it ongoing. So.
I agree. I certainly agree with that. But I also think that you can't just pick a bunch of folks and say, go figure out what you want to do, and there has to be input and dialogue and collaboration. A second example, and I won't go on, but a second example is, well, sure, LCF is in fact a terrific new approach to distributing resources, the bucks. But the fact is, the local control funding formula. But in reality, most districts do not have an accounting structure that will tell us whether or not the added money is being spent on the purposes, on the students for which it was intended by the legislators. You just can't tell. And there's emerging evidence that it's not being spent in a way that is as different as the proponents of LCFF had hoped. So even at the level of having the data to know where the resources are going and how they're being spent, you've got to have that coupled with data that tells you whether or not it's having an impact on outcomes. And I think every state, well, strike that, at least 48 states are behind the curve on that, including California. That's got to be different.
Linda Darling-Hammond, the question has come in on teachers. Linda, one of your hats is chair of the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing. Question on highly qualified teachers. Without getting too technical, there was a provision in No Child Left Behind that there be highly qualified teachers in every classroom. Some controversy about what that actually meant. I don't think that is in this latest iteration. But what does this new law mean for teachers, who are, of course, at the heart of this whole enterprise?
Well, I think that the highly qualified provision is not in this law. There is a requirement, however, that we need to be sure that low-income students and other protected groups do not have an overabundance of inexperienced, out-of-field, ineffective teachers. So that's sort of the bumper guards, if you will, around teacher qualifications. And that's going to be really important for us in California because we are just about to go back into another teacher shortage. The CTC over the last 2 years has been asked to issue a 60% greater number of permits and other kinds of substandard credentials to individuals who have not either begun any preparation or completed their preparation. So that's going to be a really important issue for us to stay on top of and really work on. There are things in Title II of the law that could be really useful investment strategies, both to address the shortage issue, like teacher residency programs, which bring people in and get them well prepared in contexts where they stay at much higher rates, usually urban and rural communities. There is guidance around higher quality forms of professional development. And I do think there are a number of pieces of the law that could support, in a state that is well organized to do it, the kinds of investments in the quality of teachers, to learn to teach the challenging standards, to have the kind of supports on the front end to actually stay in the profession that could be of use to us. But it will, like everything else we're talking about, require a certain kind of vigilance on the part of the state and creativity in taking advantage of what the possibilities are.
Tom Science, one of the provisions, another question about English learners, and this can get a little technical, but the English learners are now part of these various titles in this law, but move to Title I has to be a core part of the accountability provisions. Could you just explain that, and is that an important provision?
I think overall the Act puts English learners more to the center than they have been historically. I think there's a recognition that more than when No Child Left Behind was enacted, English learners are a critical and significant part of the public school population across the entire country. And I think you see that in what you've described. The language proficiency of English learners is now a central element of Title I and its accountability framework. It's going to be a measurement that has to be reported and measured for every school across the country, and that's an important step forward. But as with so many of the things that we've discussed, we've heard it across the board, really the Act is about realizing potential within it. And so much has to do with how it's implemented, how that data is then reacted to, how it's incorporated in ensuring that interventions are right for not just the population of students that's being served, but the resources in terms of teaching and otherwise that are available within specific districts and schools. So it really is, once again, a matter of taking the potential in the Act with its increased focus through that focus in its accountability system on English learners and making it real and making it work to shrink those education gaps that we've seen.
I'm going to ask a question which I think was more intended to kind of bring the panel down to earth. As we speak, there are millions of kids in schools, teachers and principals and many others trying to serve them. Question was, what specific recommendations do you have for high school principals today, the next 5 days, and the rest of the school year? This was addressed to Michelle Socorro. Not asking you to outline your philosophy of education, but I think the question is, what does this mean for people on the ground?
Well,
I would say for us, oh, go ahead, Michelle.
so in my point of view, it's building back towards looking at kind of similar to what Socorro was talking about, intent and results, is looking at what have we been doing and how can we actually use evidence-based strategies, all of us, not just the bottom 5%, but all of us, to actually push forward the vision of not only their school but the district, the state, and now the nation. I think they need to be looking at equity and access of how are they in particular ensuring that they're looking at access to AP courses, which is advanced placement courses, access to international baccalaureate courses, if they in fact have that program at their school. Most districts only have 1 or 2 schools that actually have that program, that they're looking at how are the CTE pathways that they currently have in their schools, how are they actually leading towards certifications, and students that are within those pathways, are they completing the pathways, or are they seeing that students are shifting and moving out? Of course, if they have under the 60-some% of students that are dropping out, then that's a significant concern, and so they should be looking at what are the barriers in place, what is happening in which the kids are not actually being motivated to persist and show that grit that's necessary in order to not only just finish high school. Finishing high school is just one step now in their educational journey. They really have to now, we are now going to preparing our students to be college and career ready. So what are we doing to ensure that they are meeting all of the requirements to get into or have the ability to get into those 4-year colleges? Now, they may not choose to do that, but it's our responsibility to get them prepared to be able to do that so that it is in fact an option for them.
I would just say really briefly, I just came from a principals meeting earlier today. For us, it's really about embracing the evidence. What is it we thought we were doing when we took those actions, when we invested that money, when we brought that group together? What were the student outcomes we were looking for? And do we have evidence that that's indeed happening? And really sharpening our saw around how we collect evidence, how we define it, how we then make decisions around that. And that varies from site to site. There are these bigger indicators, but there are also local indicators about engagement and opportunity and access and all of those. And we don't necessarily have the most sophisticated system for that, nor have we been doing that over a series of years to build capacity. So how do we build capacity in our leaders and create a system that's easy to access so everything isn't reinventing the wheel and some type of kind of crazy configuration of data, but how is it smooth for them to look at periodically over time and refine their efforts and bring people on so that it's meaningful to parents, students, and to the rest of the community as well as teacher leaders.
This is an example of, if we look ahead to what our system ought to be able to support, we shouldn't just focus on, how do we identify the bottom 5% or however, many schools for particular interventions, but all the schools are on a continuous improvement cycle. They're all looking at the data, and then we need a state system that hopefully CCEE and CDE and others will construct, where if you're struggling to make progress with English learners, there are other districts that have been identified that are succeeding. We've studied those. We know what they've done. We've got systems set up so that you can network with those schools or districts and learn directly from them and from the research. And we have a set of professional learning opportunities set up that are readily accessible to anyone who wants to solve that problem, so that they can figure out what they need, get access to the learning and the support to continue to progress. And that should be true for whatever the challenge is. If you are doing well in academic test scores but have a chronic absenteeism problem, or African Americans aren't graduating at the same rate as other students, whatever, there should be a way that with learning communities and learning systems in place for the key issues that leaders are confronting, so they always can reach out and get the help that they need, so that everybody is being identified for improvement and getting help in that regard. Even while we
just and make a point here also, because I agree with everything that's been said, but I want to take a swing at it, even though I confess to being so far away from the ground that I rarely catch a glimpse of it. But I do feel this. I do feel that if I were speaking to individual teachers or principals, I would say that they have to engage decision makers at the district level, at the school district and even state level, in a way that is collective, that is very specific, and that is informed. And what I mean by that is that, look, when I teach my law students about lobbying, one of the things I say is go into a meeting, you have to have a strategy, and that includes being specific enough that the person you're talking to knows what they have to walk out the door and accomplish in order to please you. So what I'd like to see is more union locals or groups of teachers, more sets of principals being very insistent, for example, about the kind of professional development that they are getting, that they're unhappy with, and what they want instead. And it's only by being that specific that you can start a bottom-up way of holding accountable the people who are the ultimate decision makers, the ultimate resource allocators. It's not going to come effectively enough from the top. So I guess what I'm making a pitch for is an almost militant commitment on the part of educators who, after all, chose this profession because they want to make a difference, a militant commitment to communicate effectively what they need in order to be successful. And that's the only way we're going to be able to hold folks accountable.
If I could just jump to another question, which I think kind of raises this issue that after 12, 15 years of No Child Left Behind and related reforms, how do people know, or why should they have more faith that this new iteration of reform is going to make a difference? So that does mean people coming together and really making a commitment to these reforms, doing better than the ones in the past. So there is just want to ask a couple of questions on it, and we are running out of time, but on the transition between now and when this law actually goes into effect. One of the questions is, what happens to schools that are in program improvement under No Child Left Behind? These are all schools that were effectively labeled as failing. What's going to happen during this transition?
Well, take a shot. So yeah. What the law says is you sort of maintain your current system until you get a new one in place. So we're held exactly the same. It's just continuing until the end of this school year, and then starting next school year, you're in this sort of bought year of continue with what you have until you put something new in place. So that would, I would say, incentivize the state to move as quickly as possible to replace that system with a new, more effective system. I will also say, just as an aside, this is something that we, the core districts, are now in a conversation with the federal government, because we are not in that same program, but we have a different, what we would argue, a better system. So we're hoping to actually also maintain our waiver, so to speak, for an additional year until the state puts it in place. But that's part of our own conversation as well.
Linda Darling-Hammond, isn't the federal government more or less saying now, never mind, don't have to meet annual measurable objectives? That these old provisions of No Child Left Behind are they technically in effect, but don't really mean much, or?
Well, I think all across the country you got to the place where, you know, the 100% proficiency by 2014, you know, rule left virtually all the schools in some level of program improvement or whatever. And so it became a little bit meaningless, and so people are still living under the law, some with waivers that give them some additional kind of flexibility, but I do think everybody's looking ahead. I mean, I think the mood in the country and the mood in the Department of Education and the mood and the Congress is, let's get busy figuring out the new system. So it will, you know, people will keep cranking on the old rules as much as they need to, but for the most part, every state I know is looking ahead to try to figure out how to take advantage of the new opportunities for a broader way forward. And by the way, one of the things in the law that was particularly problematic for California was what became known as the English Learner Catch-22, which is that you're aiming for 100% proficiency for every group of students, but as soon as English learners became proficient, they were taken out of the group. Therefore, the group could never become proficient, and the more English learners you had and the faster you got them to make progress, the less good you looked on the accountability measure, which is kind of this catch-22 thing. That's also relieved to some extent in the new law. So some of the ways by which schools were being identified that were not particularly valid, I think, will fall away, and we should be able to, as all of us have been saying in one way or another, focus in a much more thoughtful way on what schools need, how to identify schools that need particular things, and then the challenge is how do we get it to them in the right ways.
We've actually have time just now to go to just your last opportunity to talk about. I'm just going to go to each panelist, and very quickly, we have 8 minutes for more or less the same number of panelists, about what do you see as going forward now, looking forward, which I think everybody is looking forward now, as the opportunity here and the greatest danger. I'm going to start with Tom Sines. Very brief last thought.
I think the opportunity is what we've talked about, to make real the aspiration now in the law of closing the achievement gaps between subgroups. I focus on the potential for a vigorous subgroup accountability system and interventions that are evidence-based to focus on those different groups. I think that the danger, conversely, is that politics as usual, and not necessarily in California, though in parts of it, and in other parts of the country, takes over, and some of those subgroups continue to experience the neglect that they've experienced historically and continuously, in particular English learners.
Ryan Smith.
Yeah, you know, I'll say we're dealing with what I like to call the Goldilocks conundrum. How do we make a system that's not too hot, not too cold, but just right? And I think we can figure out how we create a system that supports continuous improvement, leadership, but also doesn't allow Black, brown, and poor children to be languishing ad nauseum. So we have to figure that out, and that's going to take some intention on the parts of policymakers, educators, parents, and the community.
Socorro.
I think the opportunity is to intentionally engage, to have all of these people and stakeholders across the state, whether it's parents or professionals, our communities, to meaningfully engage in problem solving an issue we all have expressed an intent to solve. So I think that's our opportunity, and I agree that it has to be done with an intentionality. I think the challenge or danger is that we believe equity will kind of mysteriously happen on its own. And I think that we've never seen that even with the best intentions. So I think the danger is to forget there needs to be a true push to ensure that happens. There needs to be an assurance that that common good is realized.
Rick.
Yeah, I would add to that, just again from our lessons. So one thing that we did was the way we weight our index is that over half the points, so to speak, come from closing gaps. So you definitely cannot succeed unless you're closing gaps. And I do think we have to make sure we keep that focused. The other thing I find I would just add out, because I wanted to add, is I do think there's a legitimate question of whether the state, the size and complexity of California can or should have a single accountability metrics that everyone has, using the exact same set of metrics. There may be a place where we allow some local innovation and folks to truly be held accountable to the state for some different measures as a way to actually encourage people to try different things and figure out what works locally. The time it takes to move the state can be debilitating for local innovation, and that may be something we want to look at.
Michelle Rodriguez.
So the opportunity is for us to truly look at a systems change that's going to support all of our students and ensure equity for those students, and listening to all stakeholders. So whether it's parents, students, administrators, teachers, I think the danger is that if we get mired in too much focusing on the adult structures and forget to think about and consistently talk to our students. Our students know what they need. Our students know what is best for them. And sometimes we forget to ask the very people that we are serving.
Chris, you want to share your thoughts?
Well, first, just speaking for my organization, I want to thank everybody for participating, the panelists, the audience, and everything. It's been, I think it's been a great discussion. The substantive points I guess I want to leave you with is that I think a lot in California is going to depend on the next governor. And the attitude that the next governor brings to these issues of excellence and equity, I hope will be a central part of the next gubernatorial campaign. And I think testing the candidates on their views, on their attitudes towards local control, towards state support, et cetera, all of that will be very critical. Second thing I'd say is I'm increasingly of the view that a large part of what we have to focus on is elevating the teaching profession in several ways, but in particular, I'm focused on teachers being even clearer and more forceful and more informed in insisting on what they believe they need in order to be effective as educators. And similarly, a model for principals that isn't just principal as manager, or even just principal as educational leader, instructional leader, but principal as strategist, because I think that's what's required in order to be deft, in order to be flexible, in order to respond to all the variety of, in local situations. I will also say that this is a little bit like a miner's canary issue. The hardest problems will also, if you can fix the hardest problems, there's a good chance that you're fixing all the other kinds of problems as well. If there's a group, be it English language learners or foster kids, who are struggling, and it's obvious that they're struggling, there's a good chance that the same kinds of responses you need to tackle their problems are the kinds of responses that millions of other kids need as well, but may not be as evident. I tell my students in my role as law professor that if you want to get an A on my exam, you run towards the hardest part of the problem and show me you can handle it. You don't avoid the hardest part and do the easy part. You run towards the hardest part of the problem. And I think that's the only way we're really going to break the back of these disparities in resources and in outcomes.
Linda Darling-Hammond, your opportunity.
I think that the opportunity given to us through this ESSA law is that it does allow a focus, which No Child Left Behind did not, on opportunity to learn. And we have focused in the past on equity in outcomes on tests. The tests were actually low-level tests. We now have better assessments of higher level skills, and that I think is helpful as a way of monitoring how kids are doing. But we can't really make progress unless we're also focusing on the opportunities for learning. And this law gives a more prominent place to that potential focus if California chooses to take it. That means that our indicators of opportunities to learn should be robust and carefully monitored. What are kids getting access to? There are opportunities here for us to continue to deepen the implementation of our Common Core state standards and to help educators, teachers and principals, as Chris was just saying, get higher quality professional learning opportunities around that. I hope we will continue, even though the federal scope is a little narrower than what California bit off, continue to care about how districts are implementing these challenging standards and continue to evaluate and assess that, and then organize the kind of professional learning that you were talking about, Chris, that will pay attention to what kids are getting, what kinds of curriculum opportunities. We know that achievement is a function of the quality of the teaching, the access to quality curriculum, and the investments in the material resources needed to support that. So those are the things we have to keep our eye on during this time. One thing that I really appreciate about ESSA is that it actually says if you identify a school for intensive intervention, part of that process has to be evaluating the resource needs of that school, which was off the table previously. Everybody was supposed to magically make higher test scores out of it. It's like of spinning a gold out of straw. It was like a Rumpelstiltskin idea of school reform. And now we have investments and resources and opportunity to learn on the table. So I hope that what we will do is deeply pursue that as we try to figure out the very best way to lead the country in implementing this law.
Well, thank you, and I think I got to all the panelists, and I know we got to some of your questions, but not all of them. We will look at these questions and try to respond to some of them independently and through EdSource's reporting and some of the reports that the various organizations represented here, the Learning Policy Institute, MALDEF, EdTrust West, Partnership for Each and Every Child, that we will be addressing many more of those issues. But for those of you who, I think the one great value of this conversation has been really to be thinking deeply about how we can make these reforms work. And this is just the beginning of a conversation which we need to continue. For those of you who are interested in following up on this, tomorrow the State Board of Education will be looking at this with details up here on the screen. Also, for those of you who want to participate in the regional meetings next week in Los Angeles, by the way, that will be live streamed as well. And so there are opportunities to stay involved. The materials for this webinar will be available at edsource.org. And we look forward to staying in touch with all of you. So I want to thank the panel for a highly stimulating and important discussion, and look forward to staying in touch with all of you in the future. Also wanted to thank the staff of Partnership for Each and Every Child for their great work in pulling all of this together. Thank you so much.